And today we're preparing for Mayflower 400, the anniversary commemoration of the sailing of the Mayflower. And all those locations in Britain that are associated with the Mayflower are working collaboratively together. And so what we plan to do today is tell you a little bit about the time when the Mayflower was in Southampton 400 years ago. Well, here we are inside the Church of Holyrood in Southampton's High Street. The Church of Holyrood has always been known as the Sailors' Church. And in 1620, when the Mayflower and the Speedwell were in Southampton, it is to this church that the crew of the two ships would have come to worship, to make their peace with God before they sailed the Atlantic. Sailing the Atlantic was a very, very dangerous thing in 1620. Many of the sailors knew the likelihood of returning was quite remote, so they'd want to make their peace before they left. This was very popular with the sailors. The spire of the church had on the top of it a model of a ship rather than a cockerel, which was the traditional character on top of a spire. As we're inside the church and you look towards the end of the church, you can see the railings, and on the railings are the silhouette of small birds known as storm petrels. And they're known as storm petrels because the seabirds, and when they take off, they actually walk on the water, and just like St. Peter did. And storm because in a storm they head towards the land, hence storm petrel. And they're considered by sailors to be the souls of dead seamen. And they are very, very valued, because if you're at sea in a storm and you see a storm petrel, you would follow it because it would take you to land. The Church of Holyrood also has other items contained within inside it. There is a what we call a drag anchor. There are plaques to many of the merchant seamen who've lost their lives at sea. We're now at the bottom of Vice Lane, and the building we're looking at is called the Duke of Wellington, so named from 1815 after the Battle of Waterloo, in which the Duke of Wellington was victorious. Prior to that, it'd been known as the Shipwrights' Arms, and even earlier than that, it was known as the Brewhouse. This is Southampton's oldest licensed premises and was built in 1500. And the landlord was a man called Roland Johansen, and Roland was of Dutch extraction. And one of the things that he had done is he brought with him from Holland brew-making equipment, and that had produced a very, very strong beer that the English were unused to drinking. The lane that it's in is called Vice Lane, and that is phonetic, and this would have been an area where the ladies of the night would have been, and you can well imagine that the sailors, the crew of the two ships, in their free time would have made their way up here to the brew house and a few beers, spent some time here in Vice Lane, and then made their way across to the Church of Holyrood before returning to their ship for their final departure to America. This is St. Michael's Square in the centre of Southampton's old town. And if you look carefully, you can see the Tudor house. The Tudor house was built in 1500 during the reign of Henry VII, and it was the home of John Daughtry and his wife Isabella. And John was responsible for the customs collection in the town, and he and Isabella were both very, very wealthy. He died quite young, and his wife Isabella then married Sir Richard Lister, and Sir Richard Lister was a great friend of Henry VIII, and he was a lawyer, and he was involved in the trial of Anne Boleyn, and he was also involved in the trial of Thomas More. And then if you follow round, you'll see the Church of St. Michael, and the church is called St. Michael because St. Michael is the patron saint of Normandy, and this church was actually built shortly after the arrival of the Normans in 1070. When it was originally built, it was in the shape of a cruciform, but later added to it were two little chapels and the aisles, which made it its rectangular shape that you see today. On the top of the church is a spire that is 51 metres high. On the top is a cockerel. This church is actually quite important as far as the Mayflower and the Speedwell are concerned, because aboard the Mayflower and the Speedwell there were four groups of people. You had separatists who wouldn't have gone to church, they'd have had communion on ship. But there were the settlers and there were the servants, and they would have come here to worship because they, like the sailors, would have wanted to make their peace with God before they sailed the Atlantic. Sailing the Atlantic in 1620 was a terribly dangerous and frightening experience. Many ships didn't return, and the people who were sailing on the Mayflower knew that very well. So during the 2 weeks they were here in Southampton, they would have at least attended this church on 2 occasions. We're now outside the west gate of Southampton town walls, and in 1620, had you been here in August, you would have seen Mayflower sailing up Southampton water to moor here and await the arrival of the Speedwell. The Speedwell arrived a few days later, and they had a problem with the Speedwell. The Speedwell was actually leaking, and so they had to have her repaired, and she was pulled up on the quayside, careened and recorked. They had to recork her twice because of the condition of the caulking. Other quite important events happened on this quayside. One of them was the reading of a letter, a very important letter that had been written by the pastor of the separatists, a man by the name of John Robinson. And that letter was a letter of encouragement to them and to give them guidance as to how they could collaborate and work together when they were in America. The Speedwell was repaired, but fees need to be paid for that, and they found themselves short of money because another person who visited the quayside was a man by the name of Thomas Weston, and he'd come all the way from London with some additional money for them. But in addition to the money, he had a contract, a new contract that he wanted them to sign for the loaning of the money. And they read the contract, they were unhappy with it, refused to accept it. He refused to give them the money, and he went back to London. That left the passengers on the Mayflower with a problem, and that was how to pay for the repairs of the Speedwell. And in order to do that, they sold some of their supplies back in the town. With that money, they were then able to buy all the additional supplies they needed.